The Vought news chopper didn't explode with sound or flame. It crumpled inward in complete silence and vanished in a pulse of red light, sending burning fragments raining into Times Square while every live broadcast cut to static at the exact same moment. Civilians screamed and scattered through smoke that had no clear source, staring upward for something they could blame. They expected Homelander to descend and take control like he always did. Instead, he hovered high above the city, completely still, eyes unfocused as if listening to a voice no one else could hear. Heat vision flickered uselessly while confusion slowly twisted into visible fear across his face. All across New York, Supes began dropping to their knees without understanding why. Some cried, some vomited, and others simply stared ahead, unable to move, as if their will had been quietly switched off by something unseen and immeasurable. Far beyond the skyline, in a place no camera could reach, something vast had started observing this world with patient interest. This was not an attack, and no one had been chosen as a target yet. It was the beginning of control, and worse consequences were already forming. You're not watching chaos unfold. You're watching control take root without resistance. Subscribe once, because what follows shows how this world slowly stops belonging to its own people. If you miss what comes next, you won't understand how surrender begins without anyone realizing it. The silence after the chopper vanished did not feel like the aftermath of an explosion. It felt like the city had briefly stopped existing, and then resumed without understanding what had been removed. Smoke drifted through Times Square while people stumbled through debris, staring upward at empty air that offered no explanation. News vans tried to reestablish feeds, but signals flickered and died as if something invisible pressed down on every transmission. High above the streets, Homelander hovered in place with a stiffness no one had ever seen before. His eyes were open, but unfocused, tracking nothing visible while his jaw tightened in slow, confused tension. He tried to move and found that his body obeyed, yet something inside him resisted the idea of acting at all, like a hesitation that did not belong to him. Across the city, lesser Supes experienced the same sensation without knowing why. Some fell to their knees in crowded sidewalks, others leaned against walls as nausea rolled through them, and a few simply stood still, staring ahead while pedestrians shouted in their faces. It was not pain, and it was not fear in the normal sense. It felt like the quiet removal of certainty. Inside Vought International, alarms rang for reasons no system could properly define. Communications teams reported simultaneous interference across satellite feeds and secure channels, as if something was pressing down on every layer of infrastructure at once. Technicians rerouted signals, rebooted servers, and swapped hardware without effect, while executives demanded explanations that no one could provide. Ashley Barrett stood in the command room staring at walls of static and partial feeds, her voice rising into a pitch that betrayed how little control she actually had. This was not a Supe incident, not terrorism, and not a system failure. Whatever was happening did not fit into any crisis protocol Vought had ever prepared for. Several miles away, Billy Butcher watched the chaos unfold from a rooftop through binoculars, his expression darkening with each passing minute. He had seen Supes lose control before, but this was different. No one was attacking them. Something was happening to them from the inside out, and that realization made his instincts tighten rather than flare. Back in the sky, Homelander finally tried to speak into his comms, but his voice came out slower than he intended, as if pushing through resistance he could not see. He told himself to descend, to reassert control, to remind the city who protected it. Instead, he remained hovering, staring into empty air with growing unease. Civilians began noticing the pattern. Supes who should have been responding to emergencies were either frozen in place or moving with strange hesitation. Police radios crackled with confused reports of heroes standing still in the middle of streets while people begged them to act. The illusion of immediate Supe control began to fracture in real time. Above the skyline, beyond what any human eye could track, something vast regarded the city with patient stillness. It did not move closer. It did not announce itself. It simply observed, and that observation carried weight that pressed downward like invisible gravity. Inside Vought, Ashley received a report that chilled her more than the signal failures. Multiple Supes across different boroughs were reporting identical sensations of dread and disorientation without any visible cause. Medical teams found no toxins, no radiation, no neurological triggers. The problem did not appear in scans because it was not happening inside their bodies. It was happening to their will. Butcher lowered his binoculars slowly as he noticed something else. Civilians were not affected in the same way. They were panicked, confused, and afraid, but they were still acting. They ran, shouted, helped one another, and reacted like people in a crisis normally would. The paralysis seemed focused almost entirely on those with power. "That's not random," Butcher muttered to himself. Homelander finally forced himself downward, landing hard in the middle of Times Square with a crack that sent debris skittering across the pavement. People looked to him for reassurance, for anger, for action. But what they saw instead was a man struggling to understand why he felt small in a sky he used to dominate. He looked around at the damage and realized something terrifying. Nothing here had been destroyed with force. It had been removed with precision. The chopper had not been blown apart. It had been erased. Vought analysts replayed slowed footage frame by frame and found the same impossible result. One frame showed the helicopter intact. The next showed a red distortion where it had been. There was no transition, no impact, no trace of energy they could measure. Ashley stared at the freeze frame and whispered a single word no one else in the room wanted to say. "God." Butcher watched as Homelander paced the square in visible agitation, trying to regain the sense of dominance he relied on. He shouted orders into the air, demanding whoever was responsible show themselves. His voice echoed through the buildings, but the sky gave him nothing back. Then something changed. Homelander stopped mid-sentence and looked upward again, his expression shifting from anger to something closer to dread. He wasn't seeing anything, but he was feeling something that made his shoulders tense like prey sensing a predator. Across the city, Supes reacted the same way at the exact same moment. Heads tilted upward. Movements froze. Conversations died mid-word as an invisible pressure increased slightly, enough to be noticed but not understood. Civilians felt it too now, not as paralysis, but as a heavy unease that settled into their chests. People grew quieter without knowing why. Traffic noise faded as drivers slowed instinctively. Even sirens sounded distant, muted by an atmosphere that felt suddenly thick. Butcher felt it on the rooftop and realized with a sinking certainty that this was not an attack in progress. This was the arrival of something that had not yet decided what to do. Inside Vought, Ashley watched every Supe feed show the same behavior and felt a realization settle into place that she could not speak aloud. This was not a threat they could spin, market, or fight. This was something observing them before acting. Homelander stood in the center of Times Square, looking up into empty sky with a tightness in his jaw that betrayed how deeply unsettled he was. For the first time in his life, he did not feel like the most important thing above the city. Because something else was there. And it had not even begun to move yet. Morning did not arrive with relief. It arrived with a strange, oppressive stillness that made the city feel like it had slept under pressure. People stepped outside into streets that looked normal but felt subtly wrong, as if the air itself had weight that had not been there the day before. Traffic resumed, shops opened, and broadcasts returned, yet everyone moved with quiet hesitation they could not explain. Across New York, Supes woke with the same lingering sensation they had felt the night before. It was not pain or illness, but a dull, persistent awareness that something larger than them was present. Many of them found themselves staring at nothing for long stretches of time, losing minutes without realizing it, as if their thoughts were being gently interrupted by something unseen. Inside Vought International, executives reviewed overnight reports showing identical psychological symptoms across dozens of Supes. Medical teams could find no cause, and the more data they collected, the clearer it became that this was not a biological event. It was something interacting with them at a level they did not have words for. Ashley Barrett tried to maintain control of the room, issuing instructions that sounded increasingly hollow as she realized none of their resources addressed what was happening. This was not a scandal, not sabotage, and not a soup malfunction. It was a presence they could neither detect nor isolate. Several miles away, Billy Butcher watched news reports from a small apartment with a growing sense of unease. Civilians were describing an atmosphere of dread, but they were still functioning. Supes, on the other hand, were hesitating, distracted, and visibly shaken in public appearances. The imbalance caught Butcher's attention immediately. Back in Midtown, Homelander stood on a rooftop staring at the skyline as if expecting something to reveal itself. He had not slept. He had not eaten. He simply remained there, scanning empty air for an enemy he could not see. For the first time, his confidence was not replaced by anger, but by quiet confusion. A call came through from Vought requesting that Homelander make a public appearance to calm the city. He listened to the request without responding, his attention fixed on something intangible that only he seemed to notice. When he finally answered, his voice lacked the theatrical certainty people were used to hearing. He agreed, but without enthusiasm. When Homelander descended into a crowded press area, cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, hopping to capture a moment of reassurance. He began speaking with his usual cadence, promising safety and control, but halfway through his speech, he stopped. His eyes drifted upward again, and his words trailed off in front of millions watching live. He stood there in silence for several long seconds. The crowd shifted uncomfortably as Homelander seemed to lose his train of thought. He blinked several times, trying to refocus, but something inside him resisted the effort. It felt like trying to speak over a voice he could not hear but could not ignore. People watching from home felt the same uneasy sensation as they saw their greatest hero hesitate without explanation. This was not staged. This was not part of an act. Something was happening to him in real time. Back at Vought, Ashley watched the feed with rising panic. Homelander never froze. He never faltered. Seeing him struggle to continue a sentence made her realize that this presence was growing stronger, not weaker. Butcher leaned forward in his chair, eyes narrowing. "It's not attacking," he muttered. "It's pressing." Across the city, smaller incidents began to occur. Supes responding to minor emergencies arrived and then stood still, staring blankly for seconds before shaking themselves back into action. Some forgot why they had been called. Others left situations unfinished without realizing it. Civilians noticed and began whispering. By afternoon, reports spread that multiple Supes had abandoned public duties entirely, retreating into private spaces without explanation. None of them claimed illness. They simply felt the need to be alone, away from crowds, away from noise, as if proximity to people made the sensation worse. Homelander returned to the rooftop after the failed appearance, visibly unsettled. He tried to focus on the city below, but his thoughts kept drifting upward toward the sky he could not read. The feeling pressing against him had intensified slightly, not enough to incapacitate him, but enough to make him aware of his own mind in a way he had never been before. He realized with growing discomfort that he could feel something thinking about him. Inside Vought, Ashley received new data that deepened her dread. Supes with telepathic or empathic abilities were reporting complete mental silence. They could no longer sense other minds the way they used to. It was as if something far larger was occupying the space where those connections existed. Butcher listened to intercepted chatter and felt a cold understanding form. This was not a soup problem, and it was not a human problem. Something was examining the difference between the two and quietly testing how much resistance either group had. As evening approached, the sensation across the city intensified just enough to be noticed by everyone. Conversations grew shorter, movement slowed. People hesitated before speaking, as if unsure of their own intentions. Homelander stood alone on the rooftop, looking upward again, and for the first time in his life, he felt like prey being studied by a predator that had not yet decided whether to strike. And far above the skyline, in a place no one could perceive, the presence that had arrived the night before continued observing with calm, patient interest. Because the will of this world was beginning to bend. By the third day, the problem facing Vought International had become something no executive briefing could properly frame. There was no attacker to identify, no signature to trace, and no demand to respond to. Every system they relied on to categorize threats returned the same useless result. Nothing measurable, nothing trackable, nothing that fit into a model they understood. Inside the command floor, screens showed maps of New York overlaid with behavioral data instead of heat signatures or damage reports. Analysts tracked soup response times, speech patterns, and recorded hesitation in public appearances. The numbers revealed a trend that was far more terrifying than any physical attack could have been. Supes were losing confidence in ways that could not be explained by fatigue or fear. Ashley Barrett moved between stations with forced urgency, demanding updates that all sounded the same. Technicians reported interference that did not appear on instruments. Psychologists suggested mass hysteria, only to retract the claim when civilian behavior remained largely stable. The only consistent variable in the data was that the more powerful the soup, the more pronounced the hesitation became. Several miles away, Billy Butcher reviewed stolen Vought reports with quiet fascination. He had expected panic, maybe even cover-ups, but what he found instead was confusion bordering on disbelief. Vought did not know what they were fighting, and for once, they were not pretending otherwise. Back in Manhattan, Homelander stood in front of a mirror inside Vought Tower, staring at his own reflection for longer than usual. He flexed his hands, tested his grip, and watched his eyes for signs of weakness. Physically, he was the same. Mentally, something felt displaced. He tried to focus on simple thoughts and found them drifting away before completion. It felt as if a larger awareness was crowding the space inside his mind without actually touching it. The sensation was not invasive. It was observational, like being watched from a distance so vast it made resistance feel irrelevant. In the streets, smaller Supes began quietly calling in sick. Some claimed migraines. Others refused to leave their apartments without offering any explanation at all. A few admitted privately that they felt an overwhelming sense of insignificance that made performing in public feel pointless. Vaught's public relations team scrambled to maintain appearances, scheduling interviews and appearances that were canceled at the last moment when Supes simply failed to show up. The illusion of constant soup presence in the city began to thin in ways the public could feel even if they could not articulate why. Butcher watched news footage of empty patrol routes and felt a grim recognition settle into place. The city was not being attacked. It was being shown how dependent it had been on figures who were now quietly losing the will to perform their roles. Inside the command center, Ashley received a new report that forced her to sit down. Several Supes with enhanced perception claimed they could feel something vast above the atmosphere, not physically present, but perceptible in a way they could not describe. Their descriptions were vague, but the pattern was consistent enough to terrify the analysts listening. Homelander was called into a private meeting with Vought leadership, where executives tried to speak in calm, rational tones about maintaining control. He listened without interrupting, his gaze drifting toward the ceiling as if the building itself were transparent to him. When they finished talking, he realized he had not absorbed a single word they said. He walked out without responding. Across the city, civilians began noticing a strange social shift. Without Supes dominating every visible crisis, people started handling minor problems themselves. Traffic accidents were managed by bystanders. Fires were contained by local responders without waiting for heroes to arrive. Conversations in public spaces carried an undercurrent of unease, but also a growing sense of independence. Butcher noticed it immediately. "They're realizing they don't need them," he muttered. Inside Vought, Ashley watched the same trend on live feeds and understood the danger. This presence was not just affecting Supes. It was exposing how shallow Vaught's control over public perception had always been. By late afternoon, reports came in from other cities across the country. Supes outside New York were experiencing similar sensations of hesitation and dread without knowing why. The phenomenon was spreading without movement, without a source, without a pattern they could contain. Homelander returned to the rooftop once again, staring into the sky that now felt heavy with unseen attention. He tried to fly upward, pushing himself higher than he normally would, searching for anything he could confront. The higher he went, the stronger the sensation became, until he stopped ascending and hovered in place. He realized something that made his chest tighten. Whatever was there did not need to come closer. It was already everywhere that mattered. Inside Vought Tower, Ashley received a final update that made her voice drop to a whisper. Supes with telepathic gifts were now reporting complete mental silence, as if the entire spectrum of thought they used to sense had been replaced by a single, immeasurable presence. Butcher leaned back in his chair after hearing intercepted chatter and exhaled slowly. "This isn't an enemy," he said. "It's a god deciding if this place is worth the effort." As night fell over the city, the atmosphere grew heavier again, pressing down just enough to be felt by everyone. Conversations slowed. Movements became deliberate. Even the sound of traffic seemed muted by something intangible in the air. And far above the world, the presence that had begun observing days earlier continued its silent evaluation. Because Vought was searching for something to fight. And there was nothing there that needed to fight back. By the fourth day, New York did not feel like a city under threat. It felt like a city under supervision. People moved through streets with a strange, subdued awareness, as if their actions were being quietly monitored by something they could not see. Conversations were shorter, laughter was rare, and even arguments seemed to lose momentum halfway through. Civilians described the sensation in similar ways when reporters asked how they felt. They spoke about a weight in the air, about difficulty concentrating, about the sense that their thoughts were not entirely private anymore. No one claimed to hear voices or see visions, but everyone agreed that something had changed in how they experienced their own minds. Across the city, Supes were affected far more severely. Many of them refused to leave their homes, sitting in silence for hours without explanation. Some described feeling watched from the inside, not in a paranoid way, but in a way that made their own desires feel small and unimportant. Inside Vought International, panic had been replaced by a slow, creeping dread that none of the executives could shake. They were no longer trying to find the source. They were trying to figure out how to function in a world where something greater than them was present at all times. Ashley Barrett stood in front of a large window overlooking the city, watching traffic flow with an intensity that felt misplaced. For the first time in years, Vaught's influence over the city felt irrelevant. The people outside were not looking to Supes or media for reassurance. They were looking inward, trying to understand their own unease. Several miles away, Billy Butcher walked through a busy street and noticed the difference immediately. People avoided eye contact more than usual. Their movements were slower, deliberate, as if every decision required extra thought. The city did not feel panicked. It felt subdued. Butcher realized something unsettling as he watched strangers navigate around one another without speaking. They were acting as if they were already being judged, even though no one had said so out loud. High above, Homelander floated in the sky once again, but this time he did not look confident or curious. He looked small against the vastness around him, scanning for something that remained invisible. He felt the same oppressive awareness pressing against him, but now it felt closer, more intimate. He tried to shout into the empty sky, demanding whoever was responsible show themselves. His voice carried across the rooftops, but it sounded hollow even to him. There was no echo, no reaction, just the quiet weight of being ignored. On the ground, smaller Supes attempting routine patrols found themselves stopping mid-action, distracted by thoughts they could not follow. One of them stood in the middle of an intersection for several minutes before realizing traffic had built up behind him. He could not remember what he had been doing or why. Vought analysts watched these incidents on live feeds and noticed a pattern forming. Supes were losing the ability to impose themselves on the environment. Their presence no longer dominated public space the way it used to. Civilians began navigating around them instead of relying on them. Ashley listened to reports with a hollow expression and realized that this presence was not attacking Supes. It was making them irrelevant. Butcher felt the same realization as he watched a Supe stand awkwardly on a sidewalk, while pedestrians walked past without asking for help or attention. The psychological hierarchy that had defined the city for years was quietly collapsing without anyone announcing it. By evening, reports came in from across the country describing similar behavioral shifts. Supes in Los Angeles, Chicago, and Miami reported the same hesitation, the same creeping sense of insignificance. Civilians in those cities described the same quiet heaviness in the air. This was not localized. It was everywhere. Homelander finally descended into a public plaza filled with people sitting on benches and steps, trying to distract themselves with conversation. He landed heavily, expecting attention, but few people even looked up. They were too preoccupied with the strange weight pressing on their thoughts. He walked through the crowd slowly, realizing something that unsettled him more than anything else so far. He no longer felt like the center of the world. He felt like another figure inside it, watched by the same unseen presence as everyone else. Butcher observed the scene from a distance and shook his head slightly. "He's not the top of the food chain anymore," he muttered. Inside Vought Tower, Ashley received a final report for the day that made her sit down heavily. Telepathic Supes now claimed they could sense a single, immense consciousness hovering over everything, too large to understand, too calm to be hostile, and too present to ignore. She whispered the same word she had days earlier. God. As night fell, the city grew even quieter. Conversation slowed. Lights dimmed earlier than usual. People retreated indoors without being told to, as if instinctively seeking shelter from something they could not name. And far above the world, beyond atmosphere and sight, the presence that had been observing since the first chopper vanished remained perfectly still. Because the city was beginning to feel owned. By the fifth day, the absence of a visible enemy had become intolerable for the people trained to respond to threats. Military officials could not accept the idea that something might be present without coordinates, signatures, or boundaries. They needed a target, even if they had to invent one. Inside a secured command facility, generals reviewed satellite data that showed nothing unusual above the atmosphere. No objects, no distortions, no craft, and no energy readings that justified the sensation gripping cities across the country. The conclusion they refused to speak aloud was that whatever this was did not register as something their technology could measure. Orders were issued anyway. High-altitude reconnaissance aircraft were launched, followed by drones equipped with advanced sensors designed to detect gravitational anomalies, radiation spikes, and exotic energy signatures. The sky filled with machines searching for something they could point to, something that would make this situation feel real in a familiar way. Across New York, civilians watched jets streak overhead with confused expressions. The sound of engines broke the strange quiet that had settled over the city for days. For a brief moment, it felt like action was being taken, like someone was finally doing something. On a rooftop, Billy Butcher watched the aircraft climb into the sky and shook his head slowly. He had no idea what was happening, but he understood one thing clearly. You could not fight something you could not define. Inside Vought International, executives watched military feeds with desperate hope that bordered on denial. Ashley Barrett stood with arms crossed, staring at screens that displayed altitude, velocity, and sensor readings scrolling endlessly without meaning. In the sky, the first drone reached the upper edge of the atmosphere and transmitted clear data for several seconds. Then its signal froze. Not cut off, not jammed, but frozen on a single frame as if time had stopped for it. Moments later, the feed returned to normal, but the drone had vanished from its own coordinates. The pilots reported nothing unusual. Instruments showed no collision, no explosion, and no interference. The drone had simply ceased to exist. More drones were sent. Each one reached a similar altitude and experienced the same phenomenon. Signals froze, then returned, but the machines were gone. It was not destruction. It was removal. Butcher watched a live feed of the disappearing drones and felt a chill run through him. "That's the same thing that happened to the chopper," he muttered. Inside Vought, Ashley realized the pattern at the same time. Whatever was present did not attack with force. It erased with precision. The military was not provoking it. They were being dismissed. High above the city, Homelander hovered again, watching aircraft streak toward the upper atmosphere. He felt the same oppressive awareness pressing against him, and knew instinctively that this effort was meaningless. For the first time, he understood what it felt like to watch others struggle against something far beyond them. The military escalated. A final drone was launched carrying experimental sensors designed to detect gravitational distortions. It climbed higher than the others, transmitting steady data back to command. For a brief moment, the readings spiked into patterns no one could interpret. Then the feed froze. When it resumed, the drone was gone and every system aboard had recorded the same impossible result. There had been no event, no impact, no energy surge. It had simply stopped being there. Across the city, Supes felt a subtle increase in the oppressive sensation at the exact moment the drone vanished. Some dropped to their knees again, clutching their heads as if overwhelmed by something they could not process. Civilians felt a brief wave of unease pass through them like a cold wind. Butcher noticed it and looked up instinctively. "It didn't like being searched for," he said quietly. Inside Vought Tower, Ashley stared at the screens and finally understood something that made her hands tremble. This presence was not reacting with anger. It was responding with indifference. The military had not provoked a response. They had been dismissed as irrelevant. Homelander descended into the city again, landing heavily in a street filled with people looking skyward. He realized that for once, they were not looking at him. Their attention was fixed on something far beyond him, something none of them could see but all of them could feel. The illusion that he controlled the sky had completely dissolved. As night fell, the military called off further attempts. Official statements cited equipment malfunctions and sensor failures, but no one believed them. The public had seen the feeds. They had watched machines disappear without explanation. And far above, beyond sight and reach, the presence that had begun observing days earlier remained unchanged. Because the world had tried to confront it, and had been quietly erased from its attention. By the sixth day, the world had stopped trying to define what was happening and started trying to endure it. Cities moved more slowly, Conversations felt heavier, and people behaved as if they were waiting for instructions that never came. The absence of visible action had become more disturbing than violence ever could have been. Inside Vought International, analysts noticed a new pattern forming in the behavioral data. Supes were no longer just hesitant or distracted. They were beginning to withdraw from public life entirely, avoiding crowds and retreating into isolation without clear explanation. The stronger the supe, the more severe the withdrawal became. Ashley Barrett watched the reports with growing dread, realizing this was not fatigue or psychological strain. Something was pressing against the very sense of self that allowed supes to perform their roles. Their confidence, their presence, their identity as dominant figures in society was quietly eroding. Several miles away, Billy Butcher walked through a busy street and saw the effect firsthand. A well-known local supe stood near a traffic accident, staring at the scene without moving, while civilians took charge and directed cars around the wreckage. No one asked the supe for help, and he did not offer it. Butcher recognized the shift immediately. This was not paralysis. This was irrelevance being imposed from above. High in the sky, Homelander floated without purpose, scanning the horizon for something he still could not see. The oppressive awareness had grown more focused, more intimate, like a gaze that had narrowed onto specific details rather than the entire city. For the first time, Homelander felt the sensation center directly on him. It was not painful, but it was unmistakable. He felt examined in a way that made his power, his fame, and his authority feel like trivial details in a much larger calculation. He realized with discomfort that this presence had begun paying attention to him specifically. Inside Vought Tower, Ashley received a call from one of the seven reporting a similar experience. The supe described feeling as if their thoughts were being gently sifted through, not intrusively, but with quiet precision. They could not explain how they knew this, but they were certain of it. Across the city, other supes reported the same sensation within minutes of each other. It felt like being observed from the inside, as if their very identity was being reviewed by something vast and patient. Butcher listened to intercepted chatter and felt a cold realization settle into place. "It's not watching the city anymore," he said quietly. "It's watching them." As evening approached, the sensation intensified for a select group of supes, particularly those connected to Vaught's public image and corporate structure. They described feeling drained, not of energy, but of purpose. Several of them stopped responding to calls entirely and sat in silence for hours. Homelander finally descended to the roof of Vought Tower, landing with visible tension in his posture. He walked to the edge and stared down at the city he had once dominated, trying to understand why he felt smaller in it with every passing hour. He realized something deeply unsettling. This presence was not random. It was evaluating. Inside the command room, Ashley noticed that the behavioral shifts were clustering around supes, most closely tied to Vaught's control over public perception. The pattern was too specific to ignore. This was not a general effect spreading through society. This was targeted attention. Butcher understood it at the same moment from his own observations. "It's looking at Vought," he muttered, "not as a company, as an idea." Across New York, civilians felt a slight easing of the oppressive weight that had dominated the previous days. The heaviness did not disappear, but it shifted away from them and toward something more specific. Conversations became a little easier. Movements felt more natural. Supes, on the other hand, felt the pressure increase. Several of them described a growing sensation that their own thoughts were not as private as they used to be. It was not mind reading in the traditional sense. It felt like being understood without permission. Homelander looked up into the sky again, and for the first time, he felt certain of something he had only suspected before. Whatever was out there had finally noticed him. And it had not done so out of curiosity. It had done so out of interest. The shift did not announce itself with sound or light. It arrived as a change in focus that everyone inside Vought International felt at the same time without being able to explain why. Conversations faltered mid-sentence, hands paused over keyboards, and dozens of employees turned their heads slightly as if reacting to a noise that had never occurred. Across multiple floors, people experienced the same quiet sensation. It felt like standing in a room where someone important had just entered, even though no doors had opened and no footsteps had echoed. The air itself seemed to thicken with awareness. Ashley Barrett was mid-argument with a tech team when she stopped speaking without realizing she had done so. Her eyes drifted upward toward the ceiling, and a cold certainty settled into her chest. Whatever had been pressing on the city for days was now here, not physically, but with unmistakable attention. Monitors around the command floor flickered at the same moment. Feeds did not cut out. They slowed, as if time itself had been slightly delayed inside the building. Security footage showed employees standing still for a fraction of a second longer than natural before resuming movement with confused expressions. Several floors below, Supes affiliated with Vought felt the pressure intensify sharply. One of them clutched his head and sank into a chair, not from pain, but from the overwhelming sensation of being understood in a way that made him feel transparent. Miles away, Billy Butcher listened to intercepted Vought chatter and recognized the tone immediately. Panic had returned, but this time it was quieter and far more personal. They were no longer afraid of something in the sky. They were afraid of something inside their own walls. High above the skyline, Homelander felt the change instantly. The oppressive awareness that had hovered over the entire city narrowed into a sharp, focused presence aimed directly at Vought Tower. He did not need instruments or reports to understand what had happened. The attention had shifted. Inside the building, Ashley tried to issue orders, but her voice sounded distant even to herself. She watched employees glance around nervously, each of them sensing the same invisible weight pressing down on their thoughts. No alarms rang. No systems failed. Yet everyone knew something was happening. Then the first true sign of direct interaction occurred. A large digital display in the lobby, usually filled with advertisements and Supes promotional material, flickered once and went black. For a brief moment, it showed a single red symbol no one recognized. It was not a glitch, not a broadcast, and not an image anyone had uploaded. It lasted less than a second before the screen returned to normal. Security teams replayed the footage repeatedly and found no source file, no transmission, and no explanation for how the image had appeared. The symbol had existed for a fraction of time and then vanished without leaving data behind. Butcher saw the same clip through stolen feeds and felt a chill run through him. "That wasn't interference," he said quietly. "That was a message." Inside Vought, several Supes dropped to their knees at the exact same moment the symbol appeared. They described a surge of understanding that passed through them too quickly to grasp. It felt like a thought had been placed inside their minds and removed before they could examine it. Ashley listened to their reports with widening eyes and realized this was no longer passive observation. Something had reached into Vought without moving, without entering, and without being seen. Homelander descended from the sky and entered the tower, walking through the lobby with visible tension. He felt the same focused awareness pressing against him more strongly than ever before. As he passed the digital display, he stopped, staring at it as if expecting the red symbol to return. He understood something that no one else inside the building had yet realized. This was not random. Vought had been noticed for a reason. Butcher pieced it together at the same time from his own perspective. Vought's control over Supes, over public perception, over the illusion of power, resembled something far more significant when viewed from a higher vantage point. "It thinks Vought is trying to do what it does," Butcher muttered, "only badly." Inside the command room, Ashley felt the oppressive awareness grow even heavier. It no longer felt like being watched. It felt like being examined with intent. Every decision Vought had ever made, every manipulation, every lie felt suddenly exposed under a light no one could see. Employees began leaving their stations without instruction, unable to remain in the building under the pressure. Some walked out in silence. Others sat down on the floor, overwhelmed by a sense of insignificance they could not articulate. Homelander moved through the halls with growing agitation, realizing that this was not something he could confront physically. He was used to dominating space with his presence. Now he felt like a minor detail inside a much larger awareness. And far above the world, in a realm no human could perceive, Darkseid had turned his attention directly toward Vought. Not as a corporation, but as a primitive, flawed imitation of anti-life. The change inside Vought International did not stop when employees left their stations. It deepened into something far more unsettling as the hours passed. People inside the building began forgetting why they had come to work in the first place, staring at desks and screens as if they no longer recognized the purpose behind their own actions. Outside, civilians sensed the shift without knowing its source. The strange weight that had pressed on the entire city for days seemed to concentrate somewhere distant, leaving the streets slightly lighter. Conversations flowed more naturally, movements felt less restrained, and people began interacting with one another without the same oppressive hesitation. Supes, however, experienced the opposite. Across the city, they reported a sudden intensification of the sensation that had haunted them since the first night. Several of them described feeling hollow, as if the internal drive that pushed them to perform, to dominate, and to command attention had been quietly removed. Billy Butcher walked through a crowded avenue and watched as a familiar Supe stood motionless while pedestrians moved around him without acknowledgement. No one asked for help. No one took photos. They simply ignored him like a piece of street furniture. Butcher recognized what was happening before the Supe did. The hierarchy had inverted. Inside Vought Tower, Ashley Barrett tried to regain control of the situation by organizing emergency meetings, but the people she gathered could not focus long enough to participate. Their eyes drifted, their thoughts wandered, and every attempt to speak about strategy felt meaningless under the pressure of being observed. Security footage showed Supes affiliated with Vought wandering aimlessly through hallways, unsure why they had come. Some sat down against walls and stared ahead for long periods without moving. It was not exhaustion or fear. It was a quiet collapse of identity. High above the city, Homelander hovered in silence, watching the skyline with a growing sense of displacement. He felt the same internal hollowing that the other Supes were experiencing, but his pride forced him to resist it longer than most. He tried to shout, to assert his presence, to remind himself who he was. The words felt empty before they left his mouth. In the streets, civilians began noticing that Supes were no longer acting like figures of authority. They looked uncertain, distracted, and strangely small in their own costumes. News broadcasts struggled to frame the change without admitting that something fundamental had shifted in how people perceived power. Butcher saw it in every interaction he observed. "They're not feared anymore," he muttered. "They're pitied." Inside Vought, Ashley received reports from other cities showing the same pattern. Supes everywhere were experiencing a loss of presence that could not be explained. The stronger and more famous the Supe, the more severe the effect seemed to be. She finally understood the pattern that had been forming for days. This presence was not attacking Supes. It was exposing them. Homelander descended into a busy public square and stood among civilians who barely reacted to his arrival. A few people glanced at him and then returned to their conversations. He realized with a tightening chest that he could no longer command attention simply by existing. The weight pressing on his mind felt sharper here, more focused, like a gaze examining him with clinical interest. He sensed that this was no longer general observation. It was directed evaluation. Miles away, Butcher felt the same realization settle into place. "It's not breaking them," he said quietly. "It's proving they were never as important as they thought." Inside Vought Tower, the digital screens flickered again for a brief moment. The same red symbol appeared across multiple displays simultaneously before vanishing without explanation. This time, dozens of employees saw it at once and froze where they stood. No one could describe the symbol afterward with accuracy. They remembered its color, its presence, and the feeling it left behind, but not its shape. It was as if the image had existed outside normal perception. Ashley watched the replays with growing horror. This was not interference. This was communication. Across the city, Supes continued withdrawing from public life, some removing their costumes and refusing to put them back on. Others locked themselves indoors, unable to explain why they felt the need to hide. Homelander returned to the rooftop once again, staring into the sky that no longer felt like his domain. For the first time in his life, he felt what it meant to be insignificant in the presence of something truly vast. And far above the world, Darkseid continued observing the collapse of false gods with quiet interest. Because Vought's imitation of control had finally been recognized for what it was. A crude, shallow attempt at something far greater. The revelation did not arrive with thunder or light. It came as a moment when the pressure that had hovered over the world for days suddenly sharpened into clarity. People across New York stopped mid-action at the exact same time, not because they were forced to, but because they felt something shift from distant awareness to undeniable presence. Inside Vought International, screens flickered again, but this time they did not return to normal. Every display, from security monitors to advertising panels, went dark and was replaced by a field of deep red light that pulsed slowly like a living heartbeat. Employees stood frozen, staring at screens that showed nothing recognizable yet felt overwhelmingly significant. Across the city, civilians experienced a strange moment of stillness. Conversation stopped, traffic slowed. Even the sound of wind between buildings seemed to fade as if the environment itself were holding its breath. No one knew why, but everyone felt that something had finally stepped forward. High above the skyline, the sky itself appeared unchanged, but Homelander felt the difference immediately. The presence that had been watching from afar now felt closer, more focused, like a gaze that had lowered to eye level. He hovered in place, eyes wide, sensing something vast settling into the same space he occupied. On a rooftop miles away, Billy Butcher felt the air thicken around him and knew, without explanation, that this was the moment everything changed. He lowered his binoculars and simply stared upward, waiting for something he did not understand. Inside Vought Tower, Ashley Barrett watched as the red light on the screens deepened in color and began forming patterns no one could interpret. It was not language. It was not imagery. It was presence translated into something barely visible to human perception. Then the building shook slightly, not from impact, but from a low vibration that seemed to pass through its structure without a source. Employees grabbed desks and walls, looking around for an explanation that did not exist. Outside, people in the streets looked upward instinctively. And they saw him. High above the city, suspended in the air without movement, a massive, dark figure had appeared where nothing had been before. He did not descend. He did not arrive with motion. He simply existed in the sky as if he had always been there and the world had only just gained the ability to perceive him. The sight sent a wave of fear through the crowd, but it was not the kind of fear people felt during an attack. It was the kind that came from realizing something incomprehensibly large had been watching them the entire time. Homelander stared at the figure with a mixture of disbelief and dread. For the first time, He was looking at something in the sky that made him feel like an insect. The air around him felt heavy, as if his ability to move freely had been quietly limited without him noticing. Butcher watched from his rooftop and felt a cold certainty settle into place. "That's what's been watching," he whispered. Inside Vought, Ashley could barely speak as cameras across the city captured the same impossible image. The figure did not move. It did not gesture. It simply hovered, silent and immense, dominating the skyline without effort. Supes across the city fell to their knees at the sight of him. Some cried openly. Others stared in numb disbelief. The presence they had felt for days now had a form, and that form dwarfed everything they had ever believed themselves to be. Civilians watched in terrified silence, unable to look away. No one screamed. No one ran. It felt pointless to do either. The figure's eyes began to glow faintly with a deep red light that matched the screens inside Vought Tower. The glow did not intensify, but it carried a weight that pressed down on the city like invisible gravity. Homelander tried to fly upward, trying to approach, but he stopped almost immediately. Something inside him resisted the idea of moving closer, like instinct warning him that proximity was not a choice he was allowed to make. Inside the building, Ashley realized something horrifying as she watched the feeds. This being had not come to attack. He had come to be seen. And that was enough. Across New York, people felt their thoughts slow slightly as the presence settled fully into their awareness. It did not speak. It did not threaten. It simply existed in a way that made resistance feel meaningless. Darkseid had revealed himself, not as a conqueror, but as a god finally acknowledged. Darkseid did not move after revealing himself above the city. He remained suspended in the sky with a stillness that made the entire world feel like it had been placed on pause. People stood in streets, on rooftops, and behind windows, staring upward at a figure so vast and calm that panic felt pointless. Across New York, conversations faded into whispers as civilians struggled to process what they were seeing. The fear they felt was not sharp or chaotic. It was heavy and quiet, like the realization that something greater than human understanding had settled into their reality and was not leaving. Inside Vought International, screens continued displaying the deep red glow that matched Darkseid's eyes. Ashley Barrett watched employees sit motionless at their desks, not because they had been ordered to stop, but because the desire to act had faded into something smaller and less urgent. Several Supes inside the building began speaking softly about a strange clarity forming in their thoughts. They described a growing awareness that their ambitions, their pride, and their roles felt trivial in the presence of something that did not recognize their importance. On a rooftop miles away, Billy Butcher felt the same shift, but interpreted it differently. He realized this was not mind control in the traditional sense. No commands were being given. No thoughts were being replaced. Instead, people were becoming acutely aware of how small their own will was compared to the presence above them. High in the sky, Homelander hovered without speaking, staring at Darkseid with a mixture of disbelief and dread. He felt the oppressive awareness pressing into his mind more clearly than ever before, not as a voice, but as an undeniable truth that made his own sense of importance feel fragile. Civilians began sitting down in streets and parks without understanding why. Some cried quietly. Others simply stared upward with blank expressions, as if struggling to reconcile their thoughts with the reality in front of them. The city was not panicking. It was processing something too large for emotion to handle. Inside Vought, Ashley noticed that employees had stopped arguing, stopped shouting, and stopped trying to fix anything. They sat in silence, watching the red glow on their screens as if waiting for instructions that would never come. She realized that this presence did not need to command obedience. It only needed to exist. Butcher watched the scene unfold and understood something that made his stomach tighten. This being was not destroying will. He was exposing how easily it could be diminished simply by comparison. The illusion that humans and Supes had built around their own importance was quietly collapsing. Across the city, people began experiencing moments of clarity that felt unsettlingly calm. They realized how much of their lives had been driven by fear, desire, ego, and distraction. Under Darkseid's gaze, those impulses felt suddenly transparent and less convincing. Homelander felt it most intensely. He tried to summon anger, to feel outrage at being overshadowed, but the emotion felt weak and distant. The presence above him did not challenge him or insult him. It simply made his pride feel irrelevant. Inside the tower, Ashley whispered to herself without realizing it. This is control without commands. The red glow on the screens pulsed slowly in rhythm with Darkseid's eyes, and several Supes began describing a sensation of being understood in ways they had never experienced before. They felt seen not as heroes or celebrities, but as simple beings with predictable desires and fears. Butcher lowered himself onto the rooftop edge and stared at the sky. "He's showing them how small they are," he muttered. Across New York, people stopped looking for explanations and started accepting the feeling settling into their minds. It was not submission. It was the quiet realization that resistance had no meaning against something that did not need to force compliance. Darkseid remained motionless, observing a world slowly understanding the concept he sought. The anti-life equation was not about violence. It was about proving that free will could be made to feel insignificant without ever being taken away. By the 11th day, the world no longer reacted to Darkseid's presence with shock. The initial fear had settled into something far more dangerous: acceptance. People still looked up at the sky, but now they did so with the same resigned calm they used when observing the weather. He was there, and nothing they did could change that. Across New York, daily routines resumed in a muted, subdued form. Shops opened, traffic moved, and conversations returned, but the energy behind every action felt reduced. People spoke more softly, argued less, and made decisions with unusual hesitation, as if constantly aware that their thoughts were being weighed by something greater. Inside Vought International, operations continued in the most basic sense, but the urgency that once defined the company had evaporated. Ashley Barrett walked through hallways where employees worked slowly and quietly, no longer driven by deadlines or fear of failure. It was as if ambition itself had been gently turned down. Supes experienced the change most profoundly. Many of them no longer felt the desire to perform heroic acts or maintain public personas. They still possessed their abilities, but the internal drive that pushed them to dominate situations had faded into a dull sense of pointlessness. Several of them openly questioned why they had ever needed to be admired in the first place. On a rooftop overlooking the city, Billy Butcher watched people move through streets with a quietness that felt unnatural. He realized this was not submission enforced by fear. This was something subtler. People were adjusting their behavior because they felt observed by something that understood them completely. High in the sky, Homelander remained suspended, staring at Darkseid with an expression that had long since lost its anger. He felt small in a way he could not fight, and for the first time in his life, he did not feel the need to prove otherwise. He simply watched. Civilians gathered in public spaces and sat quietly together, speaking in low tones about feelings they could not fully describe. Some admitted they felt calmer than they had in years, free from the constant noise of fear and expectation. Others felt an unsettling emptiness where their usual motivations used to be. Butcher listened to snippets of conversation as he walked past groups of people and understood what was happening. "They're not being controlled," he muttered. "They're realizing how easy control would be." Inside Vought Tower, Ashley noticed that no one was discussing solutions anymore. There were no emergency meetings, no crisis strategies, and no frantic calls to government contacts. Everyone seemed to understand, without saying it out loud, that this was beyond intervention. The red glow had faded from the screens days earlier, but the memory of it lingered in everyone's minds. Employees glanced at monitors occasionally as if expecting it to return, not with fear, but with anticipation. Across the city, Supes removed parts of their costumes and walked through streets without drawing attention. Some helped civilians quietly without announcing themselves. Others simply observed, uncertain of their place in a world where their presence no longer felt necessary. Homelander descended into a park filled with people sitting on benches and grass, looking up at the sky in silence. No one pointed at him. No one asked for help. He stood among them like another citizen sharing the same unease. He realized with a tightening chest that he no longer felt like a god. He felt like a person. Butcher watched the scene from a distance and felt a strange discomfort settle into him. This was everything he had wanted for years, but it had not happened through resistance or rebellion. It had happened because something greater had shown the world how easily its will could be diminished. As evening approached, Darkseid remained motionless in the sky, his presence constant and unchanging. He did not speak, did not move, and did not issue commands. He simply existed as a reminder that will, pride, and ambition were fragile concepts when compared to something absolute. Across New York, people returned to their homes earlier than usual, moving through streets with quiet resignation. Conversations grew shorter, and lights turned off sooner, as if the city itself were settling into a new, slower rhythm. And far above them all, Darkseid watched as the world began surrendering without ever being told to. The 12th day did not begin with panic or confusion. It began with a quiet certainty that had settled into the city overnight. People woke with the same heavy awareness they had carried for days, but now it felt familiar, almost expected, like a background truth they had stopped questioning. Across New York, streets filled with slow, deliberate movement as civilians resumed routines that no longer felt driven by urgency. Conversations were softer, arguments rarer, and decisions more thoughtful, as if everyone had unconsciously accepted that their thoughts were being weighed by something greater than themselves. Inside Vought International, work continued in a stripped-down, mechanical form. Ashley Barrett walked through offices where employees performed tasks without enthusiasm or resistance. No one spoke about fixing the situation because everyone understood that nothing about this could be fixed. Supes no longer gathered in groups or coordinated appearances. Many of them walked through the city quietly, helping where needed without expecting recognition. Others remained indoors, not out of fear, but because they no longer felt compelled to be seen. On a rooftop overlooking the skyline, Billy Butcher watched the city with a troubled expression. This was not the collapse he had envisioned for years. There had been no rebellion, no confrontation, and no victory. There had only been the slow realization that humanity's will could be made to feel insignificant without being touched. High above, Homelander hovered in silence, still watching Darkseid without attempting to approach. He felt no anger anymore, no desire to challenge what he saw. He simply accepted that he was sharing the sky with something that rendered his existence trivial. Civilians gathered in parks and public spaces again, sitting quietly and talking about how different everything felt. Some admitted they felt strangely peaceful. Others confessed they felt lost without the constant noise of ambition and fear that used to fill their thoughts. Butcher listened to these conversations and understood the final truth of what had happened. Darkseid had not conquered this world. He had shown it how easily it could be conquered. Inside Vought Tower, Ashley stood by the window watching people move below with a sense of quiet resignation. The corporation still existed, the building still stood, and the system still functioned, but the influence Vought once held over society had evaporated without a single order being given. No one needed Vought anymore. Above the city, Darkseid remained motionless, his presence unchanged since the moment he revealed himself. He did not descend. He did not speak. He did not leave. He simply continued to exist as a constant reminder of something humanity now understood too well. Free will was fragile, and the knowledge of that fragility could never be undone. As evening fell, lights turned on across the city, but they seemed dimmer than before, as if the world itself had adjusted to a lower intensity. People returned to their homes earlier, spoke less, and thought more. Homelander finally descended from the sky and walked through a street filled with civilians who barely noticed him. He felt the weight of being ordinary in a way that no battle could have forced on him. Butcher watched from a distance and realized that nothing about this world would ever return to what it had been. Because the damage was not physical. It was understanding. And far above them all, Darkseid watched in silence, having accomplished what he came for without lifting a hand. The world now knew what anti-life truly meant. And it would never forget.